materials.
Right. What kind of tests are those?
At any given time, we're usually administering 15 different tests of psychological difficulties, family background, wide variety of things that we're looking at.
And again, why are those tests used?
Because we're collecting data for research purposes.
Well, and again, why is that data not valuable in a clinical setting as well?
It can be valuable under certain circumstances, but it's not something that we routinely do in treatment.
But are the psychological tests used in clinical patients as well?
Again, we don't routinely do that either in my private practice or in the clinic at the university.
Well, the question wasn't whether it's routine. The question is, are they used when deemed medically appropriate?
Yes, there are some practitioners who use structured tests, yes.
And what additional information about an individual do structured tests give you that you don't get from an interview?
More than anything, those tests allow you to compare that individual against a wide range of other individuals.
Don't the tests also give you some windows into or suggestions of certain either personality styles, personality disorders, things of that sort?
Certain tests do, yes.
What are the tests that you have used in your practice in the research realm?
Overruled. Some leeway given across.
Yes. Go ahead.
In the past, we've used the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. We've used the Personality Assessment Inventory. We've used the Beck Depression Inventory. Again, it's 12 or 15 tests at any given time.
And I'm familiar with the MMPI. It is a widely respected test, correct?
That's correct.
And it's used throughout the country.
Yes.
And it gives you it's called the Michigan Multiphasic Personality Index. Did I say that
Inventory.
right? Inventory, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I always get the I wrong. Inventory. It gives you a sort of a general snapshot of one's psychological functioning. Would that be?
In broad terms, yes.
In broad terms, okay. And that can be helpful to you in understanding sort of what is under the surface of the presentation that a patient may give. Is that true?
I would say it's more a snapshot of the presentation than what's under the surface of the presentation.
Okay. Are there tests specific to trauma?
Yes, there are.
Okay. And what types of tests are those?
There's the detailed assessment of post-traumatic stress disorder. There's the impact of event scale. There's the trauma symptom inventory.
And what are the purposes of those tests?
To provide a picture of the impact of trauma on the person psychologically.
And in this case, you didn't use any of those tests on Mr. Okafor, did you?
That's correct.
Can you explain to the jury why those tests, let me rephrase, do you believe those tests might have given additional helpful information to you and to the jury in evaluating Mr. Okafor's present functioning?
Not in this instance, no.
Why?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you, sir.
I said not in this instance.
Why?
Because these tests require a certain reading level, and Mr. Okafor's reading level was insufficient for him to be able to validly and accurately complete the material in these tests.
Did you test his reading level?
No, that was reflected in the records that I received.
Well, you received records from, you're talking about school records,
That's correct.
and those ended what year?
I wouldn't know the year off the top of my head.
But you just assumed that he couldn't read well enough to take the tests.
No, I didn't assume, based on the reading scores that were in the school records that reflected a third grade reading level, it was clear that he would not be able to comprehend and validly respond to those materials.
So there are no psychological tests that to be given to somebody at Mr. Okafor's reading level that you believe existed from his records from the late 90s?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. Could you repeat
Sure.
the question?
You made an assumption that based upon his school records from the late 90s that he could not read, correct?
That he could not read at a level sufficient to comprehend the material on these tests.
And you made no effort to determine whether his present level of functioning might have improved since 1998 or 99.
No, I did not. Without additional schooling, there would be no reason to believe that it had improved.
But you didn't think it was important enough to give him psychological tests to determine whether he could in fact read well enough to take them.
I wouldn't characterize it as not thinking it was important enough. It was pretty clear from his school records that he would not be able to understand the material.
Wasn't part of the reason that you were specifically directed that your efforts were not to determine his present functioning?
Yes, part of it was to determine his present functioning.
So part of your assignment was to determine his present functioning?
Well, to determine the long-term impact of any traumatic experiences that he had undergone.
It was my understanding that did you come up with a diagnosis of Mr. Okafor as he exists today?
The focus of my evaluation was not to diagnose him per se.
Well, what was the focus?
To look at the impact of the adverse and traumatic experiences that he might have experienced on his current functioning.
But if you don't have a complete picture of his current functioning, how can you give an intelligent opinion of how these events affected it?
I'm not sure what you mean by a complete picture. My aim was to develop a picture of his current functioning psychologically.
And how did you do that? How did you determine his current function psychologically?
By interviewing him to assess how he was doing psychologically.
And you used none of the many available test instruments to do that?
None of them would be appropriate and valid given his reading level.
Is it your testimony that there are no psychological test instruments for people who read at Mr. Okafor's reading level?
Not for adults who read at his level, not that are specific to trauma, as far as I'm aware.
Well, let's take that in two parts. Are there any psychological tests, something similar to the MMPI or the PAI, something that gives you a personality inventory that can be given to someone of his reading level?
Not an adult, no.
And are there ways that a person that cannot read can still be given an MMPI? Isn't it true that some clinicians will read the questions to individuals who cannot read it themselves and record their answers?
There are some clinicians who will do that. Not every clinician would agree that that's going to yield an accurate result.
But so your testimony is, and just so I'm clear, that there is no way to do a psychological test that involves a personality inventory on someone that cannot read above the third grade level. It's impossible.
I'm not aware of any tests that are valid to use with an adult with a third grade reading level to do the to target the kinds of things that you're describing.
And just so we're clear, you did nothing to determine whether Mr. Okafor's reading level is actually at that level today? Right?
No, I did not.
Right. So everything you're telling us about his present function, well, let me go back. You really haven't given us any opinion of his present functioning so far in direct, have you?
I don't know that no, I haven't been asked about that.
Have you compared him to the DSM criteria for antisocial personality?
Not formally, no.
What does not formally mean? You did informally?
I did not look through the criteria and assess whether he had antisocial personality disorder.
Does he presently, in your opinion, suffer from any?
Sustained.
Might I be heard at the bench?
You might.
Thank you.
You may. Court is going to allow the question.
Thank you. I believe the question was, at this time, you are not rendering an opinion that Mr. Okafor suffers from any mental disorder or personality disorder. Is that correct?
I was not thinking in terms of diagnoses. I was thinking in terms of specific types of impairment.
Okay. What are you rendering an opinion today that he suffers from any specific type of impairment?
Yes.
Right. What impairments does he suffer from today?
The sum total of the impact of these factors and other factors that we haven't discussed today, having been bullied and
Your Honor, that's not responsive to the question. Objection, not responsive.
Sustained.
Just so we're clear, I want you to tell us what impairments, in your professional opinion, Bessman Okafor suffers from today.
the general impact of these factors is turning up the volume on emotionality and impulses and turning down the volume or the lack of a development of the ability to think things through, to plan ahead, to restrain impulses. So among other things, Mr. Okafor has an impaired ability to restrain his impulses. He has a heightened likelihood of acting aggressively. He has an impaired ability to think things through. He has impaired language ability, both difficulty expressing himself and difficulty understanding what other people say. He's likely to misread social cues. He has an elevated level of anxiety. He is haunted by many of the things that he's been through. He tries very hard not to think about them, but he's not always successful.
Okay. Anything else?
Those are the main things that come to mind.
Now, are you familiar with the facts of this case? How it happened? Why it happened?
To some degree, yes.
And you are familiar that this was a carefully planned crime? You view it that way, don't you?
I can't, your voice dropped. Misstatement of the evidence. Overruled.
You would agree that this appears to be a carefully, fully planned crime, wouldn't you?
I don't know that I would characterize it that way.
You wouldn't? How would you characterize it?
That it could as well be a result of impulsivity and a lack of thinking and a lack of planning.
Tell me what aspect of this you consider to be impulsive. Maybe let me strike that. Define the word impulsive. Maybe we're using it differently. Define the word impulsive for me as you use it.
And you need to what?
Make an objection to that.
Okay. Objections overruled. Please proceed.
I believe the question was how you define the term impulsive.
Impulsivity is where someone's emotions and instincts override their reasoning.
All right. And so just so we're clear, your impression of this crime, that it fits that definition.
Objection, Your Honor.
Legal basis?
Can we approach, Your Honor?
You may. Objection's overruled. Please proceed.
Let me just step back for a second. How much of the facts of this have you reviewed?
The main focus of my assessment, my main charge was not to review the facts of the case and the offense. It was to assess Mr. Okafor's adverse childhood experiences and trauma history and the impact of those.
Well, how much of the police reports or other statements have you read, if any?
I haven't been provided with those.
Okay, so what you know is just sort of what you saw in the media, or just anecdotal, or?
The basic facts of the case.
Okay. Well, let's move on then. You told us that you interviewed the defendant, you interviewed his mother, and you interviewed Trenton James. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. When you interviewed Trenton James, was that over the phone or in person?
It was over the phone.
All right, and I believe that was approximately a 15-minute interview.
Yes.
During that interview, did Mr. You have your notes of that interview with you?
I don't believe, I have them on my computer. I don't have a hard copy.
May I approach the witness briefly?
You may.
You recognize that as a typed transcription of your notes from that interview?
Yes.
Okay. One of the factors that you reference in this case is, let me see, household member is an alcoholic, correct?
Yes.
You asked Mr. James about that during your interview, did you not?
Yes, I did.
And he said words to the effect of that he doesn't know of Mr. Sinclair having a drinking problem since he's known him.
That's correct.
So Mr. James told you that, or you took that as meaning that Mr. Sinclair was not an alcoholic, correct?
I did at the time, yes.
Okay. And you also interviewed the mother,
Yes, I did.
and she also indicated to you that Mr. Sinclair was not an alcoholic.
That's correct.
So who says he's an alcoholic?
It was Mr. Akpan who clearly had an alcohol problem and was arrested driving under the influence.
So that relates back to Mr. Akpan.
Yes, although there was some suggestion that Mr. Sinclair might also have a drinking problem.
But you credit that risk factor because of Mr. Akpan.
Primarily, yes.
And how old was the defendant when Mr. Akpan left the house?
I don't recall off the top of my head.
You need to reference something. Go ahead. You have it.
I don't know that I have a hard copy available here.
Okay. All right. Now, let me talk a little bit about the ACE study. You've told us about the risk factors that the ACE study found, and you've talked in general terms about adverse consequences, wide-ranging adverse consequences. What are the adverse consequences that the ACE study actually found?
Well, there's a large number of them. They include anxiety, depression, substance
Can you
abuse.
slow down a little bit because I want to
Sorry.
take some notes. Anxiety, depression,
Substance abuse,
substance abuse,
elevated risk of suicide attempts,
suicide. Okay.
aggression, violence, impulsivity,
Okay. Aggression. Impulsivity. Okay.
eating disorders,
Okay. Eating. Okay. Go ahead.
psychosis,
Psychosis. Okay.
those are the ones that come to mind psychologically off the top of my head.
Anything else?
Well, then there's a wide range of medical disorders as well.
Okay. We don't need to list all those. You would agree that none of those medical disorders exist with Mr. Okafor?
Not to my knowledge.
do you find that he suffers from anxiety?
Yes.
Is that difficult to evaluate in the context of where Mr. Okafor was in his life when you saw him? In other words, facing a first-degree murder charge and a possible death penalty?
Well, I'm not just thinking, although Mr. Okafor does have a tendency to have spikes in anxiety, the picture that I got was that he's not necessarily constantly anxious. It's specific things that elevate his anxiety. For example, when we were talking about his sexual molestation, his anxiety spiked.
Of course. But when you speak of anxiety in the ACE study, doesn't that mean a more pervasive disorder involving anxiety? Just, in other words, not situational anxiety, but an overall anxiety.
No, it can be either constant anxiety or spikes in anxiety in response to specific kinds of stressors that you wouldn't see in the average person.
And what evidence of that did you see in Mr. Okafor's situation?
Well, there was anxiety that he manifested during the interview, and routinely the way we assess whether there are spikes in anxiety is asking someone on a scale of 0 to 10 or 0 to 100, with 0 being no anxiety and 10 being the most you've ever experienced, what number were you at when? So in this case, when we were talking about the sexual abuse and so on.
Did you, well, based upon what you've told us, you didn't interview any of the defendant's friends, his girlfriend, any of those people that would have seen in his day-to-day life prior to these crimes, correct?
That's correct.
Wouldn't that have given you an important window on his functioning independent of the circumstance of facing the charge he's facing?
It might have, yes.
Okay. Why did you not attempt to interview any of those people?
Because I don't think the state wants me to spend hours and hours and hours looking under every stone. It just didn't occur to me, because I had my firsthand evaluation, observation, and interview of Mr. Okafor.
Well, but if your purpose is truly to determine how these factors have affected his present functioning, you really need to know what his functioning is, independent of the circumstance he's in, which is obviously itself a huge anxiety creator, correct?
There are people with extremely, extremely high levels of anxiety that are undetectable to other people. So asking other people about that would not necessarily have yielded any useful information.
So if you had spoken to everybody that knew him and they said, nah, he's not anxious, he's a cool guy, he's laid back, he's chill, that wouldn't have had any bearing?
I've certainly worked with clients who everybody thinks is chill and laid back, and they are walking around in chronic terror.
So, well, is Mr. Okafor walking around in chronic terror?
No.
Okay. Does he suffer from depression, which is one of the things the ACE study found as a result of these matters?
No.
Okay. Any evidence that he suffered from substance abuse?
No.
Any evidence of suicidal ideations?
No.
Other than the crimes he's been convicted of, is there any evidence of aggression in general?
Yes, there's evidence of impulsivity and aggression, yes.
Okay. And is that from the school records?
Yes.
Okay. And I think we talked about those with the expert yesterday. No eating disorders?
No.
And no psychosis?
No.
You indicated, what was the word you used? A successful adult. Mr. Nako asked you a number of questions about the likelihood of him being a successful adult. Define successful adult for me.
Someone who can maintain employment, be financially self-supporting, maintain intimate relationships, function well on a day-to-day basis in terms of self-care.
Would you consider Trenton James a successful adult by that definition?
I did not assess Trenton James along those lines.
Well, I mean, from what we've heard, he appears to have not had any great trouble with the law, may have been arrested once, but he's had a full-time job, he supports himself. You spoke to him.
Yes. My recollection is that Trenton was arrested more than once, but I would say in general he's more successful than Bessman.
But I mean, in general, you would say he is a fully functioning, successful adult, wouldn't you?
To my knowledge, yes. Again, I didn't assess him per se. I don't know a lot about him, but based on my limited knowledge, yes.
But Mr. James has many of the same risk factors that his brother does. Not all of them, but many of them.
I believe Mr. James, one of the things that Mr. James himself told me is that he thought that
Objection, not responsive to the question. The question was, Mr. James.
Sustained.
Your Honor, move approach. I believe it is responsible to the question.
Please approach.
Objection is sustained.
I want to just very briefly ask you about the physical neglect risk factor. It's your information, is it not, that Mr. Okafor's mother, Catalina, worked throughout his childhood, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Do you have any information indicating that she didn't supply all of her children with everything that she could?
In the court records, when she was arrested for child abuse, it's indicated that there was inadequate food and shelter.
Well, how so? What was
Well,
missing?
The records were not that detailed, but they specified that there was inadequate food and shelter.
Well, people living in poverty often do have inadequate food and clothing. Is that not your experience?
I don't think people living in poverty are charged with child neglect because they're poor.
That was not my question, Dr. Gold. My question was that people living in poverty often have insufficient clothing, lodging, and food, don't they?
Yes.
Now, back to my question I asked, which is, do you have any information to indicate that Catalina James did not supply her children with all that she could?
I just referenced what was in the criminal record.
Would you like to answer my question?
Objection, Your Honor, you asked and answered.
I don't believe
Overruled. You may answer.
she gave them all that she could. Isn't that true?
I don't know.
No further questions.
Redirect.
Dr. Gold, counsel asked you about various kinds of formal psychological testing that you did not give to Mr. Okafor. My question is, do you give those tests to your clinical patients?
No, not routinely.
And your clinical patients are the people who come in to see you, to pay you, to treat them for their problems, right?
That's right.
Did you evaluate Mr. Okafor any differently than you evaluated your clinical patients with respect to the not giving these tests that counsel referenced?
In that respect, the evaluation was similar. Was similar.
You mentioned, I think, seeing Mr. Okafor for 8 or 9 hours. Was that on 2 different occasions?
Yes, it was.
Did you cross-reference his responses on the 2 occasions?
Yes.
About how far apart were the 2 occasions?
Objections, bolstering, hearsay.
Overruled. You can answer.
About how far apart were the 2 occasions?
They weren't. They were consistent.
I'm sorry?
They were consistent. They
No,
weren't.
far apart time-wise.
Oh, one was in October, I believe, of 2014, and the second was in January of 2015.
Okay. And you also had records, criminal records